Good morning all, and very warm welcome to today's Thoughtful Thursday, Carers' Rights. Before I hand over to Zibby, just going to go through a bit of housekeeping there. So this session is being recorded, but as we're in webinar format, any attendees won't be on screen and we won't be able to hear you. So this is just recorded and it'll go up onto our website as a resource. Just to say, if you want to contribute to the session, then please feel free to put any questions or comments either in the chat box or in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. And then also to say that closed captions are available with this session, so please do put those on if you need them. I think that's all for housekeeping, so I'm going to hand over now to Zibby, who's our Cuimhne coordinator, who will introduce our speakers for today's session.
Thank you, Aisling, and a warm welcome to everybody to our Cuimhne Thoughtful Thursday today with Irish in Britain. We're delighted today to be joined for a special session on carers matter, carers' rights, with two guests from an organisation we've been working with recently, Camden Carers. So we have, first of all, Anna Campbell, and secondly, Elion Grajcevci, who are joining us today to talk about carers' rights and the work that they have been doing in their organisation, a local charity based not too far from where we're based. We're going to hear from both of them, and then we'll have a chance for questions and discussion. And we're really delighted today to be in our team together with Aisling and Ellen, and also Dr. Mary Tilkey, who's joining us, who, as you will know, is the patron of our Cuimhne work. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anna and Elion, who are going to talk to us first. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for having us. So I'm Anna and I'm the Community Engagement Project Manager at Camden Carers.
And I'm Elion, the GPN Hospital Development Worker here at Camden Carers.
Next slide.
So in terms of what we will be covering today, we'll discuss what it means to be an unpaid carer and what is an unpaid carer. We will discuss and talk about some statistics around carers and how many there are out there and the contributions they make to the economy and wider society. We will talk about carers' rights. We'll talk about our services, Camden Carers, and what other services there might be out there for carers more locally. We will discuss barriers faced by carers in underrepresented communities. We were going to have a quiz, but we'll just save that for questions at the end, whatever questions you all might have. And we'll touch on how our services can be accessed as well. Next slide. So who is a carer? So a carer is a person who, unpaid, helps and supports another person who cannot manage without that help. This could be a relative, friend, or neighbor. These individuals tend to have learning disabilities, a mental illness, or a physical disability, but it's not necessarily the case that they have these kind of diagnoses. And it's also important to note that caring can mean many things. It could be emotional support, it can be personal care, it can be life admin things like picking up subscription. And there's no minimum amount to the amount of care that can be provided. So it can be up to 1 hour a week to over 70 hours a week, let's say. And it just covers all days of the year. Next slide, please. In terms of the contribution carers make and how many carers out there, it's estimated that 5.7 million unpaid carers are in the UK. So that's proportionately 9% of the whole UK population providing unpaid care. In terms of the economic contributions they make, that's 445 million pounds to the economy every day. Yearly, that's 162 billion. Over the period of 2010 to 2020, every year, 4.3 million people became unpaid carers. So that amounts to 12,000 people a day. So that just kind of outlines the need and the amount of carers that are out there and how many there are. It's quite a staggering amount in terms of the proportion and the amount they contribute to the economy. Next slide, please.
So now we're going to look at what rights carers have. So we know that Carers' Rights Day is on the 23rd of November, and this is sort of recognised every year, and it's a chance to sort of celebrate the contribution that carers make to society, which Elion had highlighted, and also a chance to highlight the rights carers have. So I just wanted to touch on a few of the rights that carers have. So the Care Act 2014, when it was introduced, it replaced most previous law regarding carers and people being cared for. And the Care Act outlines the way in which local authorities should provide a range of support for carers and the people that they care for. The Care Act is focused on adults. However, there's a separate piece of legislation called the Children and Families Act, which is more sort of relevant to children. And the Care Act itself includes the duty for local authorities to provide carers assessments as a right for anyone providing unpaid care, which is something Elion's going to talk about in more detail later. Another sort of piece of legislation that's relevant to carers is the Equality Act, which was introduced in 2010. So the Equality Act prevents people with protected characteristics from discrimination and harassment in the workplace, but also in services. And the Act defines 9 different protected characteristics. And if you hold one of those protected characteristics, you're protected from discrimination, or it's illegal to discriminate against people with those protected characteristics. Although being a carer itself isn't listed as one of the 9 protected characteristics, carers are protected from being treated unfairly on grounds that the person they're caring for has a protected characteristic. So, for example, if you're a carer for an elderly or disabled person, you're protected against discrimination or harassment because of your caring responsibility. And under the Equality Act, you also have the right to request time off for your caring role and to request flexible working with your employer. We've also got the Health and Care Act 2022. So this looks at carers' rights when it comes to hospital discharge. So Elion's going to cover this in more detail later again. But essentially, if someone's likely to need ongoing care and support after they leave hospital, NHS trusts have a duty to involve patients and carers around ongoing care needs. So those are the main pieces of legislation, but at the bottom I've also included carers allowance. So this is a benefit that's available to those providing 35 or more hours of care per week. So yeah, it's a benefit that's available to carers. However, if you're in receipt of other benefits, it could sort of interact with that. So it's not sort of an independent benefit that wouldn't sort of affect your access to other benefits, basically. I can send Ryan some more information about that if useful after. So next slide, please. So yeah, that sort of covers the background of sort of carers' rights and how carers operate in society. But now to look specifically at our organisation. So yeah, we're Camden Carers and we support unpaid carers who are 18 years or older, who live, work or study in Camden or care for someone who lives in Camden. So there's a separate service for unpaid carers who are sort of below the age of 18 in the borough, and we just support unpaid adult carers. And yeah, there has to be that link to Camden in order to be eligible for our service. However, there are lots of carer centres across the UK, often offering sort of a similar provision to us. So if you sort of are a carer or know someone who is a carer, but you don't have that link to Camden, it's worth sort of looking at what provision exists in your local area. And Carers Trust is an umbrella organisation operating across the UK. So if you wanted to get in touch with them, sort of look on their website, there should be information about a carer centre that would be more local to you. But yeah, sort of we support carers who are caring for someone that might have an illness, disability, mental health problem, or substance abuse or dementia. However, that's not an exhaustive list. So there's a whole range of different responsibilities that carers might have. And I think it's just important to note as well, many of the carers we work with might be supporting more than one person, or might be supporting people with a combination of the things I've just listed. And yeah, we're a charitable organisation, so we're funded in part by Camden Council, and then we tend to get different sort of grant funding for projects working with sort of specific groups of carers. So both Elion and I are working on grant funded projects at the moment at Camden Carers that we can talk about in a bit more detail later. Next slide. So yeah, just to give an overview of some of the services that we offer, we've got emotional and wellbeing support. So we have a counselling service. We deliver health and lifestyle consultations, which are a chance for a carer to speak to one of our health workers about setting sort of realistic health goals. And then they have checkups over a sort of 3-month period to help them meet those goals. And carers conversations, which again, Elion's going to talk about in more detail a little bit later. We have activities for sort of specific cohorts of carers. So we have a Black Carers Collective, we've got an older carers group, we run a mental health carers group, and we've just introduced a young adult carer strategy. And we've also got regular groups like an art group. We do sort of regular exercise sessions, that might be yoga. And then we've got different focus groups for carers to get involved in as well. We've got groups for people supporting someone with dementia, learning disability, or a mental health condition that I just touched on. And we can also provide onward referrals for carers to receive services around legal and financial support and housing support. But in terms of financial support, we do have access to different grants that we can sort of assist carers in applying for. So that might be for things like white goods, gym memberships, sort of other things that might be needed around the house. And we sort of get supermarket vouchers and other vouchers that we can distribute to carers as well. And yeah, I already mentioned that we've got a strategy for young adult carers that we've just introduced as well. Next slide.
So as Anna said, my role has been funded by a grant that essentially seeks to support carers in GP and hospital settings. So it seeks to support them by identifying them, and then supporting them as a result of identifying them, but also carers that have already been identified to try and ensure that the structures are in place to properly support them and they're cared for. The reason it's so essential to support carers and identify them in these settings is that so many carers are already being identified in these settings. So 7 out of 10 carers are currently being identified in these settings. And the reason for that is that these settings just provide the ideal circumstance to identify a carer. So by the nature of a carer supporting their cared for, they'll likely just be in these settings with their cared for. For example, a person with severe mental illnesses will be attending a health check at the GP, the annual health check at the GP, and they're likely to have their cared for with them to support them emotionally through that, or just to ensure that they attend. Or an individual with dementia, cared for with dementia, attending a hospital appointment, are likely to be supported by their carer to ensure that they go there on time. So that's what makes these settings so ideal to identify carers. But despite the level of support and identification there is in these settings, there's still a long way to go. And a lot of carers point out that there's a lot of challenges around essentially having their considerations considered in the process, for example, during discharge or wherever it happens to be, with regards to their cared for's care and their level of input during that process. So that's something that this role also seeks to address. Next slide, please. So in terms of what this role actually offers, and in terms of the ways it seeks to address those issues, is by offering training to GP and hospital staff. So GP and hospital staff are aware of carers. However, in some cases, they might not know to the extent to which they should be supporting, or to the extent to which they should be identifying and signposting them. So it's just kind of training them up to acknowledge the presence of a carer, as they might do usually, but then following that through with potential support, and essentially saying no one should be kind of redeemed of not offering that support. Everyone could offer it, from admin staff to HCA to nurse to doctor to consultant. So it's about being all inclusive in that sense, in terms of who can offer that support and how they can do it, and encouraging everyone to be as opportunistic as possible in that sense, in terms of identifying carers and supporting them. There's also opportunities that are available to us through MDTs, virtual MDTs, so multidisciplinary teams, and virtual wards I attend and me and my team attend. So these meetings provide essentially an opportunity for us to say, oh, that person is a carer. How can we support them? Can we please, with consent, have their details and give them a call, or can they be informed of our service? So this is essentially a way of us being involved in that process and representing carers in those meetings where they might not be represented, where the focus might be purely the carer, but seeking how to kind of branch it out and consider the support around the cared for, rather than purely just the patient and the cared for. So again, just supporting in identifying the opportunities of these settings. So thinking about how the structure and how that particular person within that setting can identify a carer. So I mentioned earlier the admin staff or the reception staff might not consider their role to be that of identifying a carer, but they could be in a prime position, for example, in a GP in the reception room, to say, okay, this person is clearly waiting there with their cared for, ensuring that this person has an appointment. What conversations can I open up? How can I engage this individual to ensure that they know there's support out there for them? It's also about creating rapport with these healthcare settings, to essentially say, ensure that it's as easy as possible for them to refer carers to us, to essentially break down all potential barriers, rather than just handing a carer a leaflet, for example, when they have so many things going on already in their life and in their situation, to just be able to say, to ask, would you like support from Camden Carers, for example, and then for them to just say yes, and then that's the consent, and then they just send the referral straight to us and we contact them, rather than them having to reach out to us. They're just ensuring that all these settings have that, and that ability to just quickly refer to us in that way. We also develop content that might be appropriate for those settings and reaching out to carers in those settings. So posters, flyers, whatever it happens to be, and whatever those settings are kind of asking of us, we try and do our best to kind of ensure that we can develop that content and create it for them. Next slide, please. Another service we offer is health and lifestyle consultations. So this is just an opportunity to essentially have a carer think about their health needs rather than their cared for health needs. So it's quite common for a carer to be so focused on the cared for that they might neglect their own health. So health and lifestyle consultations essentially refocuses that focus back on them and prompts them to think about their own health. So it does this through some standard physical health checks that you might receive in an annual health check. So physical, so blood pressure, body composition, and then questions around diet, exercise, alcohol consumption, and smoking status. And then the carer will be essentially have a discussion open up around how often they've had, for example, breast screenings or cancer screenings, if they're in need for them. When was the last time they went to the dentist? When was the last time they had an eye test? And these discussions will essentially prompt them to consider their health. Also discussions around mental health and sleep. And then at the end of these discussions, some goals will be set up and the practitioner will follow them up in a few months' time just to see how they're doing and whether they've managed to maintain those goals they set out to, those health goals. Next slide, please. So again, Anna mentioned this earlier, but carers are entitled to carers assessments. This is essentially a way to formalize their caring role, asking them what their caring role entails, what they need to be supported in their caring role. And it also tends to generate some income for them, for their caring role, as well as just in itself being quite therapeutic in a way to have their role validated in that sense. So this process is referred to as carers assessment, but we've kind of rebranded it as a carers conversation, and we felt that that kind of framing of it helps them to not feel as though they are being judged or assessed in that sense, but helps them also open up about their role in that sense. So yeah, so just paints a picture of their caring role and what they need to do, what their caring obligations are essentially. So formalizes that. Next slide, please. So back to essentially identifying and supporting people in hospital and GP settings. The reason that is so important is that there's a lot of benefits that come out of it, both for the cared for and the carers, but also for the healthcare settings themselves. So supporting the carer essentially leads to a successful discharge. So a carer can put arrangements in place to ensure that the cared for is supported following the discharge. So obviously, when the discharge occurs, a hospital discharge, there's a care plan kind of put into place. So there are things that the cared for needs to do to ensure that they remain healthy. But there could be cases where the cared for is not in a position to do that. And it's in these cases where the carer's involvement is vital. For example, for medication uptake, for attending hospital or other appointments, for mobility and personal care and all these things, there might be specific things that need to be done in a specific way that the carer essentially needs to be involved, and it's vital that they are involved. But unfortunately, sometimes it's the case that they are not involved. So again, reduced non-attendance, that's part of the successful discharge that can be accomplished as a result of involving carers. Carers have a unique understanding and a better understanding of the patient or of their cared for. It's because they spend, in some cases, 24 hours a day with them. So they are likely to know things about the carer, and especially with regards to communication and their needs, that a so-called expert that has spent 10 minutes with them actually might not know, even though they know the clinical side of things and the health side of things. They might not understand the communication side of things that could be so essential to supporting the cared for. So that's another reason why it's so important to include them in the process. Also, when a carer is felt that they're not included in that process, it could produce quite a bit of stress for them. So involving them in that process is important for reducing that stress and making them feel empowered and that they can do their role. So in terms of the opportunity it provides for healthcare settings, it could reduce the workload for staff. So, for example, if we think of challenging behavior, or what's referred to as challenging behavior, a cared for can be difficult in certain situations, and it could be the carer only the carer that knows how to manage and communicate with the individual during these times. So involving them and having them be there during hospital admission and discharge is essentially really helpful in that sense, and allowing them to be present in some cases in these settings just helps relieve the burden from staff and allow the carer to fulfill their role in supporting the cared for. So yeah, next slide, please.
So yes, I wanted to talk about another project that's been running at Camden Carers, that's sort of coming to an end, but hopefully we've embedded some of the learning from the project into core delivery. So that's the Making Carers Count project. So this was a project aiming to identify and support carers who were underrepresented amongst the groups we currently reach and that were disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the aim of the project was to sort of increase engagement with unpaid carers from a range of different backgrounds. But the need within Camden Carers service was sort of initially identified as being with the Somali community, the Bengali community, and the Chinese community, as those three communities sort of have a higher population within Camden, but that wasn't sort of reflected in the data that we held about carers. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, sorry, actually, can you skip back a slide? So yeah, just to sort of give a bit of an overview of the work we were doing, we sort of identified through our data that we weren't reaching those specific communities, but we also sort of widened the project out to focus on sort of carers from a range of different ethnicities, because sort of across the board, we weren't reaching a proportionate number of people from a number of different ethnicities. And what we initially did was sort of meet with different community groups in the borough that do serve those communities to try and build links, find out about the barriers that might sort of be preventing members of those community groups from accessing a range of different health and social care services. And Camden Council had also done a fair amount of research during the pandemic into why there was a lower vaccine uptake among different sort of certain communities, essentially. And we sort of gathered that knowledge together and then ran different partnerships with those organisations to deliver a series of different joint up services. So that was around sort of trying to break down those barriers. So we ran sessions for carers on site at different community organisations. We held translated sessions for community groups to sort of give an overview of our service and the types of support they could access. We opened up some of our services for carers who weren't yet registered with us to sort of give them a taste of the sorts of services they'd be able to access if they joined Camden Carers. We provided sort of training to staff around how to use Language Line, which is our over-the-phone translation service. And we also invited representatives from community groups in the borough to come and speak to our staff team about sort of being more culturally aware and sensitive to people who might have different backgrounds to themselves. So yeah, those are the different sort of interventions we took. And sort of one of the most recent things we did was create a number of translated videos, which are on our YouTube channel. So those are introductions to the service in different community languages that are sort of predominant in Camden. So there's a Somali translated video, a Bengali, an Urdu, a Cantonese, and a Mandarin translated video, sort of, yeah, giving an overview of our services. And that was sort of in part working in partnership with community groups and carers to sort of try and involve carers in what might be most relevant to communicate about our service. And as part of that, we also created an accessible English version, trying to sort of remove jargon from the way we advertise our service. So it's sort of accessible to the broadest range of people it can be. Next slide, please. So yeah, I thought as we're sort of delivering this session to sort of members of Irish in Britain, we've been working with London Irish Centre and Irish in Britain to look at how we can sort of break down some of the barriers that might be facing carers from Irish backgrounds in accessing the services. And one of the things that we did recently was have Zibia along to talk to our staff about some of the specific barriers that might present when people from Irish communities develop dementia, and sort of how that can specifically sort of present challenges for people from Irish backgrounds. But sort of thinking more generally, I was wondering if everyone could take sort of a few moments to reflect on whether they've ever experienced any barriers to accessing support related to their identity. That might be, you know, your identity as many different things. But I thought it would be useful to just have a bit of a reflection about if we feel as though there are barriers we might have experienced to accessing support. And feel free to sort of share in the chat if you'd like to. But we've also got some examples on the next slide of what carers from sort of underrepresented groups were telling us were barriers. And I guess maybe it's useful to think about sort of thinking about the groups I've just mentioned, for example, the Somali community, sort of reflecting on why we think it might be that that community is less likely to engage with services or is underrepresented in sort of a service such as ours. Okay, we'll skip on to the next slide, but if anyone does want to sort of share any contributions, please do in the chat. But yeah, so as I mentioned, we did a lot of sort of engagement work with different community organisations in the borough to find out about why, you know, what some of the barriers to accessing our service or health and social care services more generally might be. So one of the big barriers that came up sort of across several different groups was people not being aware of their rights. And I think this is something that comes up with a lot of the carers we work with, especially when we're looking at things like carers allowance, which was the benefit I mentioned. It can be very confusing to know how that might impact depending on the income that you have or other benefits you might receive. And I think sort of there not being a really clear definition of things such as who is eligible for carers allowance and who isn't can be a barrier to people sort of engaging with that support if they're just not sure what their right is around it. People not realising they're eligible for support. So something that came up with a few of the groups we work with were parent carers, not knowing that they're eligible to access support through our service. So when we talk about parent carers, it's carers who have children or sort of guardians who are caring for a child, and that child might have additional needs such as sort of learning disability or sort of mental health challenges or physical disability, and the parent or guardian sort of thinking that, oh, well, this is sort of my child, it's my responsibility to look after them, and not thinking that, you know, they're eligible for support when they've got that sort of guardian or parent relationship with the person they care for. Something that came up across the different community groups we worked with was a sense of duty being attached to a caring role. So that sort of links in with the previous point. Parents might see their child as sort of their responsibility. You know, again, not realizing that they're eligible for support if they're providing that extra level of care, if their child has sort of additional needs. But we also find that within some of the community groups we were working with, there was a sense of duty in terms of caring for a parent as they got older, living with a parent and sort of seeing it as their either moral, family or religious duty to sort of look after the older person in the family. We've got the term carer being a stigmatized term. So this was something, again, that came up, and this had come up with a couple of the Chinese community organizations that we worked with. There being a lot of stigma around sort of mental health, or sort of being seen as caring for someone or looking after someone who might have sort of mental health challenges specifically. So not wanting to access support where you're sort of identifying yourself to be a carer, or you're sort of identifying the needs of the person you care for. Stigma attached to accessing support. So this might be sort of a feeling, again, that there's a duty to provide a caring role, and that there's stigma attached to accessing support because this could be perceived as you sort of trying to pass off your caring role or sort of no longer wanting to provide care, which we know isn't the case. And we've sort of tried to reframe some of the way we speak about caring to say the support helps you to fulfill your caring role better because it gives you a chance to receive that emotional sort of well-being support with your health and well-being, rather than accessing support means that you're trying to get away from your caring role or trying to find out ways that you can pass your caring role on to someone else. And then something that's come up more generally in health and social care services as a whole was previous negative or discriminatory treatment in services, especially where it might be that the carer is acting as a sort of translator for the person that they care for. We know that people weren't necessarily being given additional time for appointments when this might be needed if there's sort of translation involved, or people feeling as though they're judged negatively on the basis of one of many or one of the protected characteristics, which could be sort of sexuality, race, sort of gender reassignment, things like that. So people feeling as though healthcare staff in general hadn't necessarily been trained in how to have sensitive conversations with people who might not share the same background as them, basically. And that, even if it was one sort of discriminatory incident that happened, that sort of putting people off engaging with health and social care services or wanting to interact with sort of health and social care services in the borough. And yeah, I suppose that sort of leads on to the last point as well, which is around there being a sort of lack of culturally competent and accessible information in health and social care services. So yeah, that might be sort of lack of translated services. So, you know, something that we've tried to do as well is have leaflets that are translated into different community languages, different resources available, different videos available that provide translation, but also trying to ensure that our staff are aware of different sort of cultural festivals or like sort of events that might impact on service users. So for example, trying to flag to staff when Ramadan is, because it might be sort of not contacting specific carers on Eid, or making arrangements for a carer to rearrange an appointment if they are sort of observing religious or cultural festivals. But yeah, those were some of the barriers that had come up in the work that we're doing. Next slide, please. But yeah, I've sort of touched on some of the appropriate support that we've tried to introduce, but I just wanted to touch on a few more things. So yeah, we introduced a group for carers from the communities that we'd initially identified we weren't reaching. So we set up a group for carers specifically from Somali, Bengali and Chinese backgrounds to attend, and sort of flagged that the reason for that group was to try and give those carers a voice and a safe space to sort of speak about some of the barriers that might specifically be presenting themselves to them, and to gather sort of feedback about how we could improve our service. But that group's been really popular, and we've sort of started to run more events and activities for that group. So the picture you can see was our was for in February last year, and it was an online group where we joined up with Northamptonshire Carer Centre to do a sort of cultural sharing show and tell session where people could come along and share objects or sort of stories or thoughts that were relevant to their caring role, but also to sort of their culture, and how that supported them in their caring role. And that was a really popular event. And sort of since then, we've opened up the group a little bit more to sort of try and invite carers from other ethnically diverse backgrounds to come and engage, if they'd like to. We use a translation service, which is Language Line. So that means that we can provide translated services over the phone to carers in a range of different languages, depending on what the need is. And alongside that, we've had some of our leaflets translated into different community languages and the translated videos that I already mentioned. We've done some equalities training for staff, so sort of looking at sort of how to be more aware of people from different backgrounds. And we've introduced a language guide at the organisation, which sort of covers the 9 protected characteristics under the Equality Act, and sort of gives a bit of background to how we should speak about those characteristics at work and when interacting with service users. We've tried to deliver services in a range of different locations to try and be more accessible to people across the borough. And one of the main things that we'd done that I previously mentioned was delivering services on site at some of the community organisations we were working with. So we did some sessions with Henna South Asian Women's Group in West Hampstead, focused on dementia, because that's what the members of that group had said would be sort of relevant and of interest to them. And then we delivered some sessions as well at British Somali Community Centre. And the specific ask from that organisation was sort of delivering health checks on site for their members. So we did that as well. And sort of throughout the project, we've tried to get feedback from the carers that have been involved, to ensure that the work that we're doing stays relevant. But that's sort of it in terms of the Making Carers Count project. I'll let Elion maybe just touch on how to make a referral on the next slide, but then we could have time for questions.
Yeah, so in terms of making a referral, you can call us on the number provided here. That's 020-742-88950, or you can email either me or Anna, so Elion or Anna, at camdencarers.org.uk. Or you can just go to our website at www.camdencs.org.uk/referrals. So now I guess is the opportunity for any questions that need to be asked or any comments around the. I guess I pass it to Zibia at this point. Sorry, but so
Thank you.
any
Thank
questions?
you so much, Elion and Anna. That was really, really helpful with loads of very, very useful information. So we're now going to open it up for people to ask questions and to make comments. Just to say, it was really great that you were really emphasising how carers often feel undervalued and overlooked, and the importance also not just of valuing people generally, but the importance of the carer in the support for people post-hospital admission, for example, and the absolute value of listening and involving carers in that kind of planning. And it's also great to be working with and hearing from organisations that are so proactive in terms of reaching out inclusively to people from different minoritised ethnic groups and interested in joining up services. We have some questions and we encourage people to type them in. There's a comment here that one participant has wanted to share, to say that they would like to reinforce how important a receptionist role is in identifying where help is needed. She says that she managed reception staff in the NHS. It was one of the questions at interview of how they could extend their role to be aware of further help that might be provided to people booking their appointment, and that they often felt that the role of the receptionist was not utilised enough as they went in, and so they were happy that your talk identified this important role. I don't know whether you want to reflect on that at all further. Or...
Yeah, I just 100% agree, and I'm quite pleased to hear that was the approach that was taken, and I see it in the same way. But unfortunately, I think it is the case that they are quite overwhelmed by. I still don't see that as a reason for not taking up the opportunity to signpost wherever that happens to be. Obviously, I will always I will speak for carers in this sense, given my role, but there's other opportunities in terms of identifying and signposting and supporting in that sense, since they are in the front line and they might see things, especially with regards to people that accompany others for their appointment. They will see things that maybe the practitioners or clinicians might not see, or GPs or HCAs might not see. So it's definitely an opportunity there. But yeah, nevertheless, it's still a challenge when I speak to GPs and talk about the potential. Sometimes it's not always necessarily agreed, but that's part of the challenges, and that's part of the challenge of my role. But yeah, I'm glad that's seen in that way as well by others.
Thank you. I'm going to bring some of the other panelists in here. So Dr. Mary Tilkey, would you like to ask a question or make a comment?
Yeah, hi, Anna and Elion. Thank you for two very informative presentations linked to each other, obviously. More a comment and an addition than any questions. I think I put in the chat that the barriers that you identified, Anna, apply to the Irish community just as much as all of the other communities. But I would want to add on a couple more that not necessarily specific to the Irish community, but we've found them working with carers, not just in the dementia field, but carers over the years. I think one of the first things that stop people accessing external services at all or early enough is the kind of fear of the person being put away. Now, that might be the family, it might be the person themselves, and families often make unrealistic expectations. I'm going to look after you, I'm never going to let you go into a nursing home. And then when the time comes, it's very difficult for them to give the care that the person needs, and they're on their knees. So I don't think that's particularly unusual to the Irish community. I've seen it in other communities as well. The other thing that is really off-putting for the Irish community, and again, it comes up in all kinds of settings, is often the first question from the doctor or the other practitioner is, how much do you drink? The assumption is that whatever the disorder, that it's down to an excess consumption of alcohol. Now, that's a legitimate question to ask. I don't deny that for a minute, but it should not be the first question. And then if people don't drink, they're not believed. If they say they drink a lot, then they're judged. So there are lots of problems associated with that. And the other thing you mentioned is about language. And you have gone, as an organization, you've gone to a lot of trouble translating or transliterating into different languages. But, you know, although the Irish community speak English, we speak it in a different way. We often use very different terms for everyday words. And we, you know, our sense of humor, our sense of irony is often misunderstood by people who don't come from that background. And I think there is a small group of people, and you will find them in Camden and in other parts of England, that are native Irish speakers. Their mother tongue is Irish. So when they get dementia or have a stroke in particular, they often lose the ability to speak in that second language. So they're often forgotten about. So these are just some of the specific issues that are worth noting in a webinar like this. So I think that's all I can add at the moment.
No, that's super helpful, Mary. And yeah, I think the fear of the person being put away, sorry, that you sort of touched on, is one of the things that we try and tackle at Camden Carers, because what might happen is sort of in the early stages of an illness that might sort of get progressively worse. People say, oh, well, I'll look after you, I'll look after you, I'll look after you. And then it's when they get to sort of breaking point and they just cannot provide the level of care that's needed, that's when it sort of becomes more of a crisis situation and sort of immediate support is needed. But what we try and say is, you know, the earlier you get support, even if it's just someone to speak to and you can manage the care, then you can sort of start to put the precautions in place to ensure that things don't get to the stage at which you just simply can't cope anymore. And especially when we think about dementia, that's something that our sort of dementia leads would look at, is sort of giving people the information they need to know how an illness could get sort of progressively worse, and sort of some of the things that someone might want to start thinking about in the early stages to sort of try and prevent it getting to that crisis stage. But yeah, in terms of the how much do you drink question, I think that's really interesting, and I sort of hadn't heard that before. So that's definitely something to sort of consider. And sort of looking at the health and lifestyle consultations we deliver at Camden Carers, that is one of the questions that we might ask, because some of the goals that carers might sometimes identify are wanting to drink less. And I guess it's sort of about ensuring that the way that question is asked is not the first question that's asked, and that, you know, there is no judgment given about whether someone, you know, might drink a lot or doesn't drink anything. So that's really helpful to sort of think about. And yeah, finally, with the point you made about native Irish speakers sort of having English as a second language, that was something that Zibia touched on when she came to deliver the presentation to our staff, about that being one of the specific challenges that might present with sort of native Irish speakers when you know, they might speak English as a second language, but dementia, sort of diagnosis of dementia might mean that they sort of revert back to speaking in their native tongue. So again, it's all really interesting things to sort of think about. And it was really useful when Zibia came and sort of shared that with all staff, because hopefully that's in their minds as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to bring in Aisling next to ask a question.
Thanks, Zibby, and thanks, Anna and Elion. This question here asks, is there any special support out there for bereaved carers?
So yeah, when carers become bereaved, so are no longer providing a caring role, they can still access our services. I think it's for 18 months after their cared for passes away. So that means they can still access all of our services, essentially. I think carers assessments or carers conversations is something that they wouldn't be able to access. But in terms of sort of access to grants, counselling, health and lifestyle consultations, just someone to speak to as well on our sort of support and wellbeing phone line, that's still available to the bereaved carer. And then we don't sort of offer specific bereavement services. As a carers organisation, that isn't where our specialism lies. But as was previously mentioned, we can provide onward referrals. And I think this can be sort of useful for the carer because, you know, if it's someone's first caring role and they're cared for, you know, especially if they've been providing a high level of care, when the person they care for passes away, they might not have necessarily thought they'd need bereavement services, so haven't done much looking into it. But we can sort of provide onward referrals to services within the borough where we can't provide that service ourselves.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And Ellen, would you like to come in with a question?
Thanks, Debbie, and thanks Anna and Elion for a very informative presentation so far. You've spoken about various pieces of legislation, for example, the Health and Care Act 2022. Are you aware of any further legislation that's in the pipeline or calls for further legislation that might support and protect the right of carers?
Yes, so there is a law that's being passed at the moment that I think is coming into effect later in the year, which is around workplace, sort of like your rights in the workplace. I'd have to look specifically at what that legislation covers again. I mean, I'm not sure if anyone else sort of might know, but it's around basically from day one of employment, people being able to request flexible working. And being given, I think, up to a week of carers leave, which is unpaid leave, but at least having that right to sort of take carers leave. I think at the moment that's not, employers might offer it, but it's not sort of like a requirement. But I think it's from April this year, there will be the requirement for employees to make the case that they need sort of flexible working arrangements and to exercise their right to take carers leave. But again, I don't know all of the ins and outs of it, but yeah, I think it's coming into effect this year.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I have a question here from somebody who's asking about the work that individuals or communities could do to help to encourage more support for family carers. They're noticing that the allowance for family carers is very low. I think it's around £76, is that right? And people are obviously often giving up other paid work to take on that role. Is there anything that organisations like Irish in Britain or any of our member organisations, what can we do to raise awareness about this? What are the campaigns that are out there?
I mean, that's a difficult one because the allowance is really small, and it's unlikely that that will change too much. But there are other access or pots of money that can potentially be accessed depending on circumstance. So Anna mentioned, it was mentioned that in a carers conversation that funding could be generated, and then there'll be other grants, such as, for example, the hospital discharge fund, which is essentially a pot of money that has been tied into my role as well. But it's essentially if someone is being admitted or is due to be admitted or has recently been discharged from the hospital about 2 weeks, then they have access to essentially a pot of money or sum depending on what their needs are. So it could be for a spa weekend or anything that the carer might require, or something around the house to support them with their care needs, bed rails for the cared for, whatever it happens to be. So there are pots of money that are around. I can't say this, but essentially the best thing I think an organization in general could do is try to link a carer into the carer's service, like local Camden Carers would be for a carer in Camden, but whatever local services that are out there, and then they should be able to link them into any other potential pots of money or support that they might require. So it could be that they are struggling to pay for gym, and then subsidies or funding around that could be supplied as well. So it could be indirectly supporting them through giving them what they need rather than direct access to funding. But yeah, in terms of the carers allowance, that is, yeah, that's a very small sum of money, and it's other sources need to be sought out essentially.
Thank you so much, Elion, and thank you, Anna, too. We're at time now, so we there are so many questions and ongoing discussion to be had, aren't there, about carers and carers' rights. But we really want to say a very warm thank you for highlighting many important issues and also reflecting on the questions that have come in, and to say that we're looking forward to continuing our collaborations together. That the recording from today's session we're going to make available online, so people will be able to listen back or share it with others later. And a very big thank you from us, and to highlight that as well as all the resources on caring websites and Camden Carers website itself, we also have a number of resources which are particularly culturally relevant to people from Irish community backgrounds, and please do take a look. We've shared the links in the chat. So many thanks, and we're going to close our session now. Thank you.